All right. Well, hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here to hear more and talk more about the mental health pipeline, the workforce pipeline. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, because maybe you've heard that term, but have no idea what a pipeline has to do with the mental health workforce or your role as students. Or maybe you have a sense of what workforce pipeline issues are, but want to know what are strategies that we can do to address it. So regardless of where you are on this issue, we're excited that you're here today and to be able to talk a little bit more about it. So we're going to tell you a little bit about us, and we hope to hear a bit from you too about who's in the audience. I see a bunch of people have already pulled up the Padlet and are using it, so thank you for that. If you haven't already, you can either use that tiny URL there or scan the QR code. Most of your tablets or phones, if you pull up the camera app and point it at that QR code, it'll prompt you to open it up in your mobile device's web browser. And so there you can introduce yourself, ask questions, or respond to some of the questions that we have in the Padlet. And we also, one of the questions there is what you hope to get from today's workshop. We'd love to hear that as well. And again, I'm keeping an eye on this so that hopefully if there's something that I see there that we can address, we can do so. Then we'll talk about what this whole workforce pipeline thing means and how we might best address mental health workforce pipeline issues. We'll do that by doing breakout groups for about 15 minutes to generate ideas based on some of the things that we start talking about. And then we'll regroup and sort of discuss what we've come up with, as well as talk about some of the strategies discussed in the literature. And the goal is to have some time for Q&A. So again, while we introduce ourselves, tell us in Padlet what you hope to get from today's session. And that is listed as question 1 in the Padlet. It's column 3. So first, a bit about us. My name is Dr. Mel Wilcox. Please feel free to call me Mel. I am a counseling psychologist. I got my PhD in counseling psychology at the University at Albany in 2015. I am a first-generation graduate, and so first in my family to go to college at all, much less complete it, much less complete graduate school. And so when we talk about mental health workforce pipeline issues, we're largely talking about underrepresented folks who historically have been marginalized from higher education and professional fields, and the barriers to our completion. And so that's something that is very personal to me as a first-gen graduate. And my research tends to look at very similar things. My research is in kind of 3 broad areas. One is in multicultural psychotherapy and psychotherapy training, so culturally responsive care, in the areas of whiteness, racism, and mental health. And also, most related to what we're going to talk about today, in racial and economic inequity in higher education. That includes in professional psychology.
And hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Riana Anderson. I have a PhD in clinical and community psychology from the University of Virginia. If you know anything about me, I'm born and raised and returned to Detroit, though I'm in Chicago, just got here a few minutes ago. So happy to be joining you still from the Midwest. So if you think about my research in a nutshell, I love a lot of the things that Dr. Wilcox said. Another way that I think about it is how can we drop kick what racism does to the psychosocial or psychological outcomes of Black adolescents and their families? And how do we intervene with these culturally relevant protective factors so that XY relationship, that really strong predictive relationship of racism, I not only want to bend it, but I want to break it by using culturally relevant interventions. So that is me.
Thanks, Dr. Anderson. I think these next few are yours. So I believe you're going to tell us a bit about what this whole thing means anyway.
Yes. So we're curious about what this whole workforce pipeline thing means anyway. So if you have some ideas, feel free at any point to drop them in the chat. So I'm going to open it up just for a moment, either in the chat or if you want to come off of mute. What do you understand the workforce pipeline to mean? I'll give it just a few seconds because we'll want to make sure that we hear from you a lot later. But just thinking at the beginning, when you hear this idea of a pipeline or the workforce pipeline and specifically leaks in it, what does that mean? So again, feel free to come off of mute or drop it in the chat what you think. For those of you still formulating your thoughts and or wanting to know a bit more about it. So feel free again to just share what your thoughts are in the chat. But when we're talking about pipeline issues as the facilitators, we're thinking about how pathways from a particular profession, starting from the earliest point, like pre-K, through 12th grade education, all the way through postgraduate credentialing are impacted. So here we're seeing an example of how pipes interconnect to go from one place to the other. This idea of a leaky pipeline is when at any point in these junctures, you have spaces in which there's not that continuous flow. There are things that leak through and that don't make it either at all from one point to the end or have some challenge getting through. And we know that in particular tends to happen to folks from marginalized backgrounds, folks of color, and also folks from various socioeconomic positions as well. We'll be talking about those two issues in particular today, but we're thinking about how that, if they're not getting to the end of that pipeline, or if it's challenging to go through that continuity of the pipeline, that underrepresentation or that the challenge with which it takes to get from one place to the other is going to impede not only their ability to excel by the end, but other people's ability to think that they in the future can make that milestone as well. So that's what we mean by pipeline issues. With respect to what causes these leaks, we're thinking about several factors. So inadequate preparation and opportunity are some of the more common thoughts on how, again, we're going to continue to show these depictions of how throughout this continuity, either specific people or groups of people are impeded at each of these term points. When we're thinking about some of the major components of what makes it more feasible for you to get through this pipeline, we're looking at Garriott's critical cultural wealth model, which looks at some of the various conditions that can help folks to go more smoothly through. Things like structural or institutional conditions like economics, but then things that impede, again, are racism, classism, and sexism. So if you have an advantage in some of these economic or racial characteristics, on the flip side of that, the challenge might be racism, classism, or sexism if you're in one of those oppressed groups. On the one hand, social emotional experiences like having a campus or feeling like you belong on that campus or within your program can increase that continuity. But again, on the flip side of that, having challenges with that is going to be a challenge to make it all the way through. Things like normative capital, where some people may know which courses to take to start a research assistant program at the start of college or even before for some people, those types of things that some people may know because of their experiences, that cultural capital that's coming from perhaps their parents or their families, that may improve people's flow. And it can also, again, on the flip side, impede people's ability to get through as well. For folks who tend to be oppressed in some of those identities, you might see where there's conflict between campus, family, community, culture, and expectations. And again, we'll be diving into more specific examples as we go through. Finally, this idea of cultural wealth with respect to this model takes a look at elements like critical consciousness, where we're challenging some of the things that have been expected or given to us and make us question what is it that we want to do in this profession, what is it that we want to even study, some of those things that may pop up. And again, family and community capital might be things that either improve that flow or impede, depending on what your family or what your community knows about navigating this experience. When we're thinking about where in those previous depictions of where leaks are coming from, some particular examples might be not fostering the career interest and academic self-efficacy of pre-K through 12th grade students of color. And again, I'm going to share some specific examples of that, even with myself in the future. Reliance on standardized tests for admissions. So what you saw perhaps in a lot of programs this year was abolishing GRE. So Michigan School of Public Health, as an example, abolished the GRE, understanding just how difficult this year was on students, but also looking at the data of how SATs or GREs predict outcomes and, or excuse me, academic outcomes, and that they're not as tied to expectations or outcomes as people once imagined. But the predictor of them, what your race is, what your socioeconomic income is, so much tighter. So those beginning predictors are tighter than those outcome predictors of just how good you're going to perform in those academic spaces. So we know race, class, income, et cetera, are tied to SAT and GRE performance. Things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, and homelessness. And again, Mel's going to talk quite a bit, or Dr. Wilcox is going to talk quite a bit about that coming up as well. The inability to afford education or professional requirements. So we're talking about the professional continuum, and for us, going into the licensed portion of psychology, in which you take the EPPP, which costs a certain amount of money every time you need to take it, the study materials, et cetera. So even being licensed or credentials after spending so much time, just getting to that last step is something that can impede as well. And things that are linked to that as well, criminal background disclosure requirements, such as findings from the US Department of Education Disparate Impact Report. So I'm going to kick it off with some examples of racism throughout different elements of the pipeline, and then we'll kick it off to Dr. Wilcox to take a look at socioeconomic impacts of the pipeline. So I wanted to start here because we've been talking about this pre-K through 12 element before we even get to college. So I know that so many of you are advanced in so many ways, and so you may be even questioning why start so early. But if you're understanding what those pipeline leaks look like very early on, it makes a lot more sense to figure out why the flow might be challenging and why we might be seeing leaks throughout for various groups. My work focuses quite often on Black families, and so I'm going to be taking a more narrow look at Black folk, but you will see in a few slides how there are disparities across racial groups as well. So when we think about school discipline, I'm sorry, thanks. When we look at, we're doing like this like telecommunication of when to turn, so apologies for some of the slides that might be go back and forth.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So when we're thinking about racial disparities in school discipline, and also I'm going to introduce Tiger. If Tiger makes a noise, you'll see it. Tiger, come meet the people. Come on. If Tiger comes over, I'll show you our little fluffer that's gonna make some noise. When we're looking at racial disparities in school discipline, the takeaway here from this graphic is that Black students are 3 to 4 times more likely than white peers to be expelled or face multiple suspensions from school. So when we think about what that means, less or fewer days in school, more record of being a nuisance, more, if we're thinking about tracking, people's inability to recommend these students for advanced academic levels if they think that they're going to be challenging behaviorally. So it's, again, not just that they're expelled more or suspended more. This is fewer days in school, less learning time, and it's going to impact the teachers for potential recommendation of these students going to a higher academic track. So Dr. Wilcox, we can keep rolling. And that doesn't stop in pre-K through 12. If you take a look at higher ed, this is, I really appreciate finding this graphic because it's taking a look at a very literal pipeline from every 100 students that go through these high school to higher educational opportunities. So for every 100 students across these racial groups, and again, I'm going to zoom in on African Americans because that's the group that I think about quite a bit with my work. In that orange column, the fourth over, for every 100 African American students, 85 get a high school diploma, 21 get a bachelor's degree, 8 get a graduate degree, and less than 1 get a doctorate. And you can take a look now at that bottom row where you're looking at various groups. So Latinas and Latinos are half as likely to get a doctorate relative to Black people. But for white folks, between 1 to 2 of those 100 students get a doctorate. For Asian Americans, 2 to 5 get a doctorate. And for Native Americans or First Americans, 0.5 to 0.6. So we're looking at disparities across that highest level of professional attainment, and throughout you would see those differences as well. But you're seeing that pipeline, you're seeing leaks throughout, especially relative to other groups throughout for African Americans. Dr. Wilcox, thank you. This is one of my favorite slides from the pandemic. It's funny to me. It doesn't have to be funny to anybody else, but it is funny to me because what you're watching is this NIH racial funding disparity. So even if you are one of those 0.5 people like myself who were able to get the doctorate, and I think in psychology, our numbers are 2.5%, if I'm not mistaken, for Black psychologists. So if you're one of the very few people in the academy who does have a background like ours, and you make it through the applicant stage, you make it to the review stage, you make it to the funding stage of NIH, what this image was showing how elements throughout, like being encouraged to exit academia, being pushed to the side of this ladder to even apply, being pushed off at different levels like review. And again, it's not funny, but it's funny because there's no context whatsoever. So when you see this, it's just like a perfect example of what it feels like to be in the academy, to just be pushed off of these levels, even if you make it to these stages. So what we're watching here is being pushed off at the review stage, not being funded because there's an element of groupthink and people who are heralding the knowledge at this funding stage, who think alike, who don't have the same concerns about some of the things that are important for you. That makes it challenging, even in the highest of it. So even as someone who's producing the knowledge, I'm not able to get funded. And I'll take the liberty just briefly, because I definitely want Dr. Wilcox to have so much time. There's a current call out for structural racism NIH grants. And I was on the call asking a question about preliminary data. So for NIH, if you're applying for millions of dollars, they want you to have data to say, okay, we trust that you're going to be able to handle this grant, to execute this grant in the way that we imagined. And I asked, what about COVID? What about the impact of COVID on our ability to get preliminary data? Will anything be taken into consideration there? And the program officer said, and I quote, well, COVID impacted us all equally, so no. And she's telling me that someone who not only had COVID, but who lives in Detroit, has served as a grief counselor for various groups, knows so many people who were lost, knows that my community experienced COVID at 2 to 3 times of the folks around us. And that my work could not go on because I'm an interventionist who does community-based work. So it was so short-sighted and narrow-sighted and preposterous because the grant is on structural racism. It's a beautiful depiction of what we're watching in this slide. And she's acting out what's happening at those top rungs when she's telling me it doesn't matter that we just had a 15-month pandemic, you should still be able to submit this grant and have preliminary data. So even in the highest rungs of ed, if you make it through all those pipelines, there are still issues at this point. So I'm just gonna note in these final points that as there are those leaks in that pipeline, what happens is that, and what we understand to be some of the challenges within that pipeline is that there's a lack of evaluation of the critical points of the leak. So in all the pictures that we've been showing, we're showing you these pipelines with droplets coming through. But why are these droplets coming through? What would happen if we created better supports at each of those points? What's causing the water to come through in the first place? There's a lack of evaluation of those critical points, and that is why racism is able to flourish the way that it does. It also leads to this attribution then of people of color not being able to make it. So some of us might think, okay, because I keep watching people not make it through, or because even if, again, I want to just continue to underscore this, even if they make it through, it could be more challenging. It's not flowing as well for some people. So then that might be internalized, in which people are asking, well, why can't I make it through? What is wrong with me that I can't do this? This is the brief example of one of those people. So I was told in graduate school during my first semester, when I was struggling with research, that I shouldn't be in the academy. And maybe this place wasn't for me. I was told that by a white male professor who didn't ask, well, what are the things that we could do? Because you've already been accepted into a graduate program. What can we do to support you? How can we pair you with someone who can support you better? The thought was, well, maybe you just shouldn't be here. And that was expressed verbally, but you feel that in a number of spaces. And you might internalize that as imposter syndrome. You're not good enough to do it. But again, I was verbally told that. And now I'm at a point where I see that same colleague at conferences and we're sitting on the same panels, and it always makes me question what would have happened if he did give me that support or pointed me in a different direction. I wonder if I use that as fodder to make it through, but that's not the case for everyone. For some people, they would take that and say, it is time for me to exit. I now need to leave this pipeline before I complete it. So I just wanted to give that example for anyone who might be struggling right now. Exactly. So we just had that in the chat. For anyone that's heard that, for anyone who's experienced that, you are not unique, but it should not exist. We should not have that type of feeling or that type of expression, but it does require us to be mindful that that is a part of this design of this leaky pipeline for us not to make it through. But we can.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Dr. Anderson. And you know, what's interesting is that it might seem as though we're going to shift gears a little bit, and yet we're not. Because you know, what I'm reflecting on hearing you talk about your experience is that I've heard the same messages just from a different angle, right? And so, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about economic precarity in higher education as one more thing that contributes to the leaky pipeline, and the ways in which this works intersectionally to increasingly push out folks who sit at the axis of multiple forms of oppression. And so those folks are at even higher risk than I am. So for instance, I come from a lower socioeconomic status background. I was a first-gen student. There were a lot of barriers and I received very similar messages based on those identities, but then I also had whiteness to protect me, right? So my peers of color who otherwise shared my economic background and were first-gen students were at even higher risk of some of these things I'm going to talk about than I was, and very likely experienced even more complex microaggressions and you know, things that would suggest that perhaps we shouldn't be there than I did. But because of the economic barriers that I was experiencing because of my background, I received similar messages. You know, maybe you can't do this, maybe you shouldn't be here, including explicitly, because clearly you're having trouble balancing everything. And I wish I had known when I was in school that I wasn't alone. That so many people are struggling to just get by economically in college. But, you know, higher education is really still sort of designed around folks who are independently wealthy, I don't know, especially graduate school, but folks who can afford to take care of the cost of education, the cost of living, without having to sacrifice time and working a lot through school, et cetera. And that's just not most people's reality. We have good data now, especially thanks to the Hope Center for College Community and Justice, which I always try to hype. They and Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab at Temple are fantastic. And they have so very much data at this point that shows us that the normative college student is not one who is independently wealthy, but the normative college student now is one who is struggling to meet their basic needs. And while that is statistically true, that not everyone is impacted by that equally, right? So here you see, this is actually a snapshot from a New York Times feature based on one of their reports, I believe, that that demonstrated that nearly half of college students in one report reported going hungry or experiencing food insecurity. And so nearly half, that's a lot, right? But again, these things are not equitably distributed. So yes, up to 50% of students, depending on which survey you're looking at, experience food insecurity, which means not having enough food to eat or not having access to nutritious food. But as you can see from this chart from one of the Hope College's reports, that 50% for food insecurity is not distributed equally. So here we have about 55% amongst Native American students reporting food insecurity versus 36% amongst white students, right? So once again, the folks who are the most marginalized are experiencing these detriments at a greater rate. Some of my own research has shown that, unsurprisingly, food insecurity is related to having a lower GPA, having worse physical health, reporting more distress. And I also found that students of color and lower socioeconomic status students were more likely to be food insecure. I also happen to collect data from faculty, staff, and administrators, and I will use the quotes from that study for the rest of my career. And, they included things like, this is a real quote, if students would just stop spending money on drugs and gadgets, they would have money for food. And there's a lot there to unpack, and we don't have time for that today. But clearly there's a problem there, right? That we have 50% of students in some studies, 30% in my study on that one campus, reporting genuine food insecurity and detriments of food insecurity that make it hard to get through college, and genuinely lead some folks to drop out. And then some faculty, staff, and administrators not only not realizing that it was a problem, but being antagonistic to the very idea that students are struggling. Goldratt further tells us that at least 1 in 10 college students are homeless, and that's homeless, not even housing insecurity, where people might be couch surfing or not know where they're going to live next month or next week. And one sample reported approximately 1/3 of students being housing insecure. And so if you're going hungry, if you're not sure where you're going to live or how you're going to stay there, how on earth are you supposed to focus on your academics, right? So think about that chart that Dr. Anderson showed us that showed that 85% of Black and African American individuals graduate with a high school diploma, but then only 21% graduate with a bachelor's degree. Do we think that only 21% started college? Probably a lot more than 21% started college, right? But how many get to finish? And so the consequences of things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, and those are just 2 extreme examples of economic precarity in higher ed, but there are many more. And the consequences of that are attrition. So leaving college without getting your undergraduate degree, leaving graduate school without your graduate degree, if you're lucky enough to have what you need to finish the undergraduate degree. Even for folks who do persist, there's substantial student loan debt borrowing and overworking and skipping meals and healthcare. And so we see that there are these high need groups who, like, just because they're borrowing a lot in student loans doesn't mean that their basic needs are getting met. That's covering maybe rent, maybe fees at school, books, things like that. But that doesn't mean that there's money left over for food or for healthcare, for getting, for an emergency sick visit if you need it. And so, unsurprisingly, again, we find, including in my own research, that students of color, lower socioeconomic status students, they borrow more in student loans and report a lot more of financial related stress. And also, we know from other research that that students of color are steered toward more predatory private loans as well. And of course, this is a problem that demonstrates that they're struggling while they're in school. And then, of course, once they graduate, they're left with this whole other huge problem, right? Which just keeps the disparities going. And so why is economic precarity so substantial, right? Why are so many people struggling economically to get through school? Why is it so much worse for some groups? Why is it so much now than it was before? Well, clearly it's because we're eating too much avocado toast, right? So if millennials in particular would just stop eating avocado toast and, stop doing things like killing Bennigan's and, Applebee's might be next, who knows, just, killing those chain restaurants. So stop eating avocado toast, but definitely spend your money at chain restaurants, then we would be okay, right? We would just stop spending money on gadgets and drugs, then we'd be all right. So clearly that's the answer, right? And that brings us to one of my very favorite journal article titles of all time, even though this is about the healthcare system, but it still applies. And it really is this simple and this complicated. Why is economic precarity so severe? Because everything's too expensive and we don't make enough money to cover it. It really is that simple and that complex. And the things are more expensive for folks who have less resources, needing to do things like cash your check at Walmart and pay a few dollars to do it rather than having it deposited into a bank account if you can't get one. And folks from marginalized communities have less access to economic resources to pay for how expensive everything is. And it's for these reasons that research by our own Federal Reserve Board has now repeatedly demonstrated that the millennial generation is the most highly educated, most indebted, least well off with the lowest wages and least in assets generation in history. And this is not unique to millennials. This is about trends over time. And so Generation Z is in for the same fate if we don't start dealing with many of those systemic factors. So what does that mean for us in psychology, right? In terms of who's able to get through and who doesn't? Well, for one, our Center for Workforce Studies data suggests that, or shows us that most recently, 83% of the psychology workforce is white, even though white and white non-Hispanic individuals only comprise 76% or 60% of the population. So clearly, we're not getting, there's a leaky pipeline in psychology. Otherwise, we would see more equitable numbers in the psychology workforce. And in addition to the data that the Center for Workforce Studies has on race, in one of our most recent studies that we published, 80% of doctoral students and those who graduated with their PhDs rated themselves as upper middle class or upper class. And so again, there appears to be a leaky pipeline class-wise, because we know that's not proportionate for how the United States is broken down class-wise, right? So, and these are just some of the groups that we have data on. We don't have a lot of great data, but we can guess that if this is happening by race and social class, that it's happening at the intersections as well. And then when we do persist, when we do stay in, so we make it toward the end of that leaky pipeline and maybe at least get the doctorate, right? Often we had to do that with a lot of student loan debt, and folks from marginalized backgrounds, particularly students of color and lower socioeconomic status students, have to do that at a much, much greater rate. So my own research has found that specifically in psychology, students of color and lower socioeconomic status students borrow a lot more. They report a greater likelihood that they're going to delay major personal and professional life milestones, like buying a house, having children if they want to have children, changing jobs if they're not happy in their job, and specifically because of their financial situation, because of student loans. So here you've gotten this PhD, right? And that was supposed to be what pulled you out of a certain economic situation. And really, it just changed the shape of a difficult economic situation, but it stays difficult. And we also found that lower socioeconomic status students reported less perceived support from their graduate programs, very consistent with my experience, greater credit-related stress, and that all of these things worsen intersectionally, and I can show you what that looks like in just a moment. We did find that students from Ph.D. programs borrowed substantially more in student loans, and in fact, we lose the significant effect by race when we include folks from Ph.D. programs, because everybody's borrowing a lot for some of the more predatory programs, and that sort of muddies the data. So what does that actually look like? Most recently, from data collected in 2016, on average, folks were graduating or expected to graduate with about $126,000 in student loan debt. But again, this isn't equitable. So the average for all of our white participants was about 122, so pretty close to that average. But then for Black and African American participants, it was closer to $200,000. 185,000 was the average for Black and African American students. By social class, similar trends. The average was 158,000 for those from the lowest socioeconomic status versus less than 100,000 for those from upper classes. Now, clearly there's still a problem, right? If folks coming from the highest echelons of social class are having to borrow a lot, but it's not an equitable problem. So why does this matter? What does student loan debt have to do with this, right? Well, for one, students or graduates who come from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds and students of color, when they graduate, they're more likely to stay in jobs that they're unhappy in and work to burnout to help deal with these things. They're less likely to work in public service sectors where they're working with the most high need people because they pay less. And when you're buried in $200,000 in student loan debt, it might feel like a luxury to work in a public service setting like a community mental health center or a place that's not going to be able to pay you what the private sector can. And critically, for all those parts of the pipeline that we've talked about before, people are increasingly recognizing that this is a problem. And I've heard from undergraduates and once even from an Uber driver that they wanted to go for a doctorate in psychology, but they didn't think they could ever afford it. And they didn't want to graduate with a mortgage. And so we're losing people that we never even get the chance to meet who look at this problem and say, why on earth would I take on a mortgage to work in this career where then I'm not even going to make enough to doing what I want to do, which is often serving the underserved, to actually make a living and do so comfortably. So then what do we do about this problem, right? We know that there are these multiple barriers across the lifespan of education, where we lose people at sort of each juncture and also within each phase. So it's a multifaceted problem that has many potential solutions, right? Because we're working along a number of layers. So we're going to have you join breakout groups for approximately 15 minutes to start to, before we tell you what some of the literature says, we really want to hear from you first, that what do you think based on your experiences, based on what you've heard, that we might be able to do across different system levels. So at the individual level, like changing attitudes and behavior, the interpersonal level, like interpersonal support, the creation or enacting of policies and procedures, and at the structural level, so state policy, federal policy, how might we address the leaky pipeline through, and we're gonna, if we've got enough people, we're gonna try to break you out and to specifically focus on, for group 1, student preparedness, group 2, power dynamics and systemic racism and classism, and 3, by directly addressing economic barriers at these different levels. So, so in your groups, talk about what are some of the things that you think we could probably do at each of these levels in these domains to start to patch the leaky pipeline and help more people get through who we're traditionally losing.
So you'll be able to choose the room that corresponds to that group number. So again, if you want to talk about student preparedness, go ahead and go to where it says room 1, go all the way to the right where it says the number, and then you can click join. Room 2 is power dynamics, systemic racism and classism, and room 3, economic barriers, and we'll drop the systems levels again, just so that you have what levels you can kind of discuss with your group. We'll drop that in the chat. And if you have no flipping clue what we're talking about at all, feel free to come off of mute or to drop us a chat so that we can facilitate getting you to the right place. So welcome back, everyone. We were gonna have folks to report out in the Padlet, but I think we've got enough time for folks to verbalize what you were able to chat about and what types of solutions you thought about. So if we could start with group 1, you can let us know who was in your group. You can let us know some of the things that you thought about, but give us some feedback on what you would do with student engagement for group 1.
I'm aware of our time, and I know we didn't get a chance to talk about some of the things that the literature says, but y'all have already covered a lot of it also. And you know, some of it's obvious. Pay people more and pay them enough to live, right? But there are also specific programs that do exist that we always like to make people aware of. And so I think, to my recollection, there's a Dropbox that we can like put PowerPoint slides in, right? Excellent. And so, you know, then y'all can sort of see some of the models that we found in the literature, as well as other tangible strategies, other programs that exist that you can look into if you are one of the people we are talking about. And you're like, yeah, how on earth am I gonna, you know, the interpersonal stuff's gonna be hard enough. How am I gonna financially, you know, possibly get through undergrad, get through grad school? Then there are some tangible programs that do exist that can help with some of those stopgaps. But Dr. Anderson, do you have any final thoughts that I'm not thinking of?
Yeah, I'm such a strengths-based person. I'm like community psych 101 all day. So I absolutely have to say that while you were talking, Dr. Wilcox, like you use the word problem and then you use the word fix. As scientists, that's what we do. We look for problems and we ask, how do we solve it? So some of the models that we're showing, they're not like, oh, well, we guess this is something that could possibly work. It's like, here are community-based participatory strategies that you can infuse into the pipeline to reinforce it. Here, like literally, we have done the studies. Here are the ways that we can improve this. So it's both protest, which I'm here for all day, every day, and the science. We've got the science behind it. Dr. Wilcox has shared a number of her own studies. I'll be completely honest and say this stuff isn't my lane, but like we have a number of people who have given time, thought, effort, and energy to this and have shown us the way. So with science, with data, with theory, with drive and passion, with our own example, like we can do this. And I want to just continue to encourage you all to persist. We will try to resist as much as possible so that we create structure so that you don't have to be resilient. You don't have to be the person who's stretching and making it through these adverse situations. We will protect you as much as we can. And to the extent that I continue getting, impaled by some of this stuff, I might leave my dang old self. So, it's not worth everybody being impaled all the time, but to the extent that we can protect each other and we can make it through, that's what we are here for. So I just want to acknowledge that we have the science, it's in the PowerPoint. So I really encourage you to check that out and to tell us how we can assist you persisting. So
yeah. I echo that very much. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I've dropped my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out with any questions, and we'll send the PowerPoint slides to be uploaded. And I just want to thank you all for being here today and for being so engaged. It was wonderful to hear your ideas and your feedback, and we appreciate your time. And also thank you, Dr. Anderson, for co-presenting with me today.